Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I know people are still coming in, so we will be starting in 2 seconds. Now, kia ora, Buluminak, and Pacific greetings to all of you. Thank you so much for being here. We acknowledge the type of ground we stand on and we gather today, which belongs to the Naitahu community. And we also acknowledge the cosmological presence of the Pacific gods and ancestral world, which we're supposed to be part of. And just before we begin, I'd like to call upon the representative of the Macmillan Brown Centre to gallant our chief guest tonight, the Pacific Way. Well, thanks so much, Sophia. Now, this evening we have it's very special because we have a very special guest here. The issue of unconscious bias has been part of our lives, part of our institutions, part of our world. Every time you turn on television, you see images of it, you see evidence of it. Every time you hear people talking, in our own experiences, in our own lives, we engage with either conscious or unconscious, or bias, or somewhere in between, subconscious, I believe. And often we're not conscious of that, fundamentally because of the way in which it's so embedded, institutionalized in our own, if you like, socio-cultural DNA over the years, from a young age, even as we grow older, towards our grave. Now, and of course, they're manifested in different ways. Now, today we have an expert, an international expert on the issue, Professor Benjamin Reese from Duke University. Now, his CV is so amazing that I tried to memorize all of them. I told him before we came in that usually when I speak or when I introduce somebody, I refuse to refer to a piece of paper. Because you talk to yourself, because I want to talk to people, real people. And now, Professor Reese has been working in the area of diversity and equity for a long, long time, much of his professional life and adult life, since he left university and started working in New York, running clinics for people with psychological, social problems, and he has been a consultant for a number of corporations and for a number of not-for-profit organizations, educational institutions over the years. At Duke University, he was the vice president, the equivalent of the deputy vice chancellor here, of the institutional equity, which looks after issues of diversity, of equity, of discrimination, of affirmative action, of sexual harassment within the university. Now, Duke University, as we all know, is in the Deep South. And the history of the Deep South is indeed deep. This is where slavery was very much part of everyday life in the 1800s, and where racism, where the Ku Klux Klan bred and expanded their influence, and they haven't totally disappeared. I first met Professor Benjamin Reese last year when I was a Fulbright scholar at the Duke University. I spent some time at UCLA and then took the bus with my wife, Mary, across the country in a doghound bus. Not all Americans have taken that route because it's supposed to represent something which is the opposite of the image of America you see on television, which Hollywood constructs for all of us. And when people ask me, how did you get here? Oh, I went by Greyhound, 3 days and 3 nights across the continent. They laugh at me because no academic does that. Now, and apart from that, he has been invited all around the world as an expert in the subconscious bias, as a consultant for a number of corporations, including the Pentagon, in the White House, and he does courses and workshops for solicitors and barristers, for those in the legal profession, for those in the area of education and so forth. Now, since May, he decided that he would want to engage with the world much better rather than being locked away in an institution like Duke, because he's invited to go everywhere in the world. Before he came over here, he was in Dublin, in Ireland, and he was in China, and then he's on his way to Australia, and then we stop him on his track, make sure that he engages with us for 1 week, and then when he goes back, he's going to China, and then Japan, and then the list goes on and on. Now, we're so happy to have Dr. Reese here, the expert on subconscious bias, and then he will talk to us for about, say, 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. I know that we have had experiences this year in March during the shooting, which was, if you like, a volcanic eruption of some kind, which brought to the surface some of the underpinning, if you like, prejudices and tension which exists in our society. So perhaps we're going to discuss some of those as well in relation to how does subconscious bias, which is embedded in all of us, lead to cases of explosions of violence and expressions of anger in a public and in a violent way. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Reese to come up and address us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and special thanks to Stephen, Marie, for everything that they've done. It really has been a journey getting here. I mean, we had a plane delay, then a plane canceled, but the real journey has been over the last 50 years, getting to this place and just having a lot of intense life experiences, which I often tell my colleagues and my children has shaped me as much as, probably more than getting a doctorate, because I spent so many years, you know, sort of in the trenches, in the community, learning more about myself, and certainly the topic of diversity. I started this work in New York City. When I was in high school, I was spending a lot of my time not in class, but on picket lines, demonstrations, sit-ins, etc. And it was a time in New York City where every student had to take an IQ test. So I tested very high, but I barely got out of high school. And my parents, who were big on education, they didn't really know what higher education was, but they said whatever it is, I was to get it. So with like, I don't know, a C+ average or something, I applied to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, etc. And I was shocked when every single place turned me down, including the 2-year community college that I applied to. And I was working about maybe 10 hours to help my family out financially. And so I was determined to go to school. So I was able to go to a 2-year college, not as a regular student, but as a part-time student, basically because, believe it or not, there was no tuition. You paid about $40 US or so a semester in fees, but there was no tuition. So I started my college education. I took 2 courses, English Composition 1 and World History 1. After the first semester, the governor of New York State said that he was going to go to the legislature and he was going to ask them to impose $15 US per credit for the first time. And I didn't know how I would ever afford that. And I was into my sit-in protest mode, so got some of my friends from some of the local colleges, and certainly from Bronx Community College, where I was going. We got on the New York City subway, went to Manhattan, went to the governor's office, put our sleeping bags out on the street, and we vowed to sleep there in protest until the governor changed his mind. And we slept there for 3 days, got a lot of press coverage. A couple years ago, 1965. Slept there for 3 days, and for some reason the governor totally ignored us, imposed $15 of credit, and I scraped together the money and was able to finish my time there. But I think back to that sleep-in as one of the first times I was part of a leadership group that tried to impact issues of equity and fairness, access to higher education. So I've spent the last 50 years hanging out around the US and around the world, trying to make some contribution in terms of issues of social justice and fairness. And the last 18 years or so focusing on implicit or unconscious bias. And I'll go back and forth between implicit, unconscious bias. There are some technical differences, but if you allow me to sort of conflate those terms, I'd appreciate it. As you can see, explicit bias, the stuff that you say, you know what you're saying, you're conscious of it, you know why you're saying it, you're conscious of the beliefs and attitudes, as opposed to implicit or unconscious bias, which is below the surface, out of awareness. I think most of us, myself included, focuses on the explicit stuff. I think that I'm sensitive, caring, spiritual. I like to try to help other people, etc. But it's harder to recognize that there's some stuff that's out of awareness, some attitudes, some beliefs that are not really comfortable to acknowledge, but they're part of who I am, and they're part of who everybody is. And so I'll repeat this a number of times. It's sort of central to understanding unconscious bias is the notion that we are conscious, explicit in attitudes, things we say, we do, but there's a whole other thing going on that's out of awareness, that's more uncomfortable to talk about. And we think that the kind of unconscious stuff, the way we immediately respond to the way someone looks, the way they sound, etc., we think that that kind of immediate response that we don't even think about, we think it goes way back to cave people's time, when those people had to respond to animals or whatever immediately, not think about it, had to figure out what's dangerous, what's not. But you can imagine if you are interviewing someone or you're a faculty member, it's the first day of class, student walks in the room and you have an immediate, you size them up, you either like them or you don't. You either think that they're bright or they're not immediately. You can see the kind of danger in that. But it's part of the human process, and we think that it goes all the way back to those early days. There is a researcher, you're probably familiar with Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman's economist, he won a Nobel Prize in 2011. He tries to to think about unconscious or implicit bias in this way. He says, our thinking process occurs in two ways. This kind of thoughtful, effortful, deliberate, slow analysis. We're aware of what we're doing. And then this other process, if you will, which is immediate, out of awareness, unconscious. So both of those are going on at the same time. The system two thinking, that's very conscious and deliberate. It's the kind of thinking that you use when you're analyzing a math problem. If you think of physicians, assessing various evidence-based approaches to a particular illness, being very deliberate, analytic. And then this other kind of thinking, which is immediate, just sort of out of your gut. And so he thought about and did a lot of research about these two ways of thinking, two ways that the brain operates. And there even, if we have more time, we can talk about some of the cutting edge research that looks at the brain and actually identifies parts of the brain that are more prone to utilize type 1 versus type 2 thinking. Now, there is a test that gets at implicit or unconscious bias. And you're probably familiar with the implicit association test, or the IAT test. So it's an online test developed by a couple of colleagues of mine in the late 1990s. So you go online, and if you take the race test, you'll see on the screen faces of either a black person or a white person, and you'll see words, positive words, negative words, good words, bad words, etc., and they'll instruct you to press the keys on the keyboard. And the theory is things that are closely connected in your experience, in your memory, you respond to quicker, and things that aren't as connected in your experience and your memory, it takes us a millisecond longer to respond. So if you say happy and flower, you probably could respond to that faster than saying happy and death. So what the test shows, and there's some controversy I'll talk about, what the test shows is if you see a black face on the screen, you have a quicker response to the black face and negative words than you have to the black face and positive words. If you see a face of a white person on the screen, you have a quicker, faster response, just milliseconds, to the white face and words that are positive than words that are negative. Again, it's this type 1 thinking, it just happens without any kind of analysis. And at the website where you take the implicit association test, there are other tests in addition to the race test. There's a gender and career test, which gives you feedback as to whether you connect gender and science or gender and working in the home. There are some political tests. There are weight tests that sort of get at bias around weight. And all the tests are based upon this theory that things that are closely connected, we respond to unconsciously much faster than things that aren't as connected. And the connections occur as a result of lots and lots of life experience. Now, where the test gets controversial is when you take the test, by the way, you get feedback at the end of this 15-minute test, and it might say, you have a strong tendency to connect white with positive or black with negative. You have a moderate connection. You have a weak connection. You have no connection. Some people will interpret those results as meaning you're racist, sexist, homophobic. So that's part of the controversy, the way people interpret the test. And if you take the test, any one of them, a second time or third time or fourth time, you might get slightly different answers, slightly different responses. And so part of the controversy is it's not a test that has a significant degree of reliability. I implore people when they take the test, and I encourage people to take the test, not to think of it as a test of your own individual bias, but instead to use the test as an opportunity to think about what the results might mean in terms of your associations at that particular time, and to use it as a test that stimulates reflection. But since the test has been around since the 1990s, there are literally, I think they're probably up to about 18 million people who've gone to the website and taken one of the tests. And they're in a bunch of languages, they're all over the world. There are children's versions of the implicit association test in addition to the adult versions. So with that large of an N, you begin to see some trends. And so, for example, in the United States, of the, about 7 or 8 million people who've taken the race test, about 80% of people who take the race test have more positive connections between white, being a white person, and positive words, and they have a strong connection between black faces and negative words. And about 25 or 30% of African Americans have the same kind of connection. And so when you have a very large N, a lot of people taking the test, you have some powerful answers, powerful trends that I think tell us something. So here's one researcher, and you can see it's about a little bit more than 3 million people who've taken the test. And by the way, when you go to the website, you put in demographic information, but you don't put in your name. So there's a lot of data about trends related to gender, geographic area, et cetera. So you can see these over 3 million people. You can see taking the race test, the kind of strong connection with being European and things positive. But as I said, you know, it's not an individual test of bias, but when you look at large numbers of people, you start seeing a trend. So one of the things that's been discovered is that when you use the implicit association test and you give it in lots of different countries, they've discovered that countries that have a stronger connection between men and science, it just happens to be the same countries where there's a larger gender gap in science and math. So there's some indication that the test is not an individual test of bias, but when you give it to large groups of people, it seems to be telling us something. And we know in urban areas of the United States, those urban areas that have a large implicit racial gap on the implicit association test, those are the same communities where there's a large number of police shootings of African Americans. And we know that those countries, again, where there's a large racial gap in terms of the implicit association test, they're also the countries where there's a large black-white gap in health disparities, particularly related to infants. So this test, again, I can't say it enough, don't take the test and say, oh, it says I'm racist, I'm sexist. It's not a test of individual bias, but it really is getting at something in terms of large groups of people. So again, it's all the stuff that we're conscious of, explicit, and then there's stuff that's out of awareness, that's unconscious, that's implicit. We used to think that, well, these implicit biases really started to develop somewhere in adolescence. But we've come to understand that at least the foundation for implicit bias is really starting much earlier. So when we track the eyes of infants and we see what they're staring at about 4 weeks of age, infants will stare longer at female faces if a woman has been the primary caregiver. So it's not about implicit bias, but we think it's the beginning of a kind of tendency, predisposition, if you will. We see a difference in the frequency. About 9 months, infants will be seen to stare longer at faces that have the same or similar complexion as the primary caregiver. It's not about race, but again, we think we're seeing the foundation of a kind of categorization, if you will. And then in about 10 or 11 months, we see infants will stare longer at faces that are speaking in the same or similar language as the primary caregiver. So again, we think we're seeing the beginning, the foundation of what later becomes implicit bias. But certainly in infants, it's just a kind of propensity or tendency. But after infancy, then the world, all of us start attaching meaning to these things. All of this stuff in the environment of young children. Whether it's through the media, TV, things that our youngsters see around the house, people that they see around the house, or people they don't see around the house. The way gender and race are portrayed in movies. All of this stuff at a very young age starts seeping into the heads of youngsters, almost like osmosis. And I think we'd like to think, I would like to think, well, you know, lots of young people, certainly my own kids had friends of all backgrounds. You know, you have a party for them, it's like the United Nations, etc. The best friend is a different race and gender. Well, that occurs parallel to this other process, kids beginning to take in the stuff in the environment. And so when you do research with youngsters, and some of the research is, I mean, personally painful. You see youngsters who have friends of all backgrounds, but you sort of do tests to get at their unconscious bias, the kind of unconscious stuff that's going around in their head. And you see indications that they've taken in this stuff in the environment, and they're already beginning to have the kind of biases that we all have. You know, there's a researcher who gave the children's version of the implicit association test to a bunch of kids, and then to their parents also. And these are 4th to 6th grade children. And they gave the children also a survey. The instrument sort of looked at how strong the bond was between them and their parents. So some of the kids had a strong bond, strong identification. Some had a weaker bond. But they both gave them the implicit association test. They found out that the kids and their parents had a similar level of bias. But particularly for those kids who in the survey showed a strong bond with their parents, a strong identification. And it's just one of many indications that of all the things that impact children as they grow up, it's certainly the parents, both through the kind of direct things they say, but more importantly, the kind of things that they model. What kids hear parents say, who's over the house, who's not, what kind of TV shows they watch, what they do online. All of the stuff that may seem kind of innocuous are powerful models for children as they grow up. So a piece of research to give you an idea of how powerful and how early the process operates. So this research was done with kids 4 to 6 years old. So they show them first the picture that's on your left. And so when a light-skinned white child is on the ground, black child is behind the swing, they ask them to make up a story. When the black child is behind the swing, the stories are more often the child pushed the other child off the swing. When the white child is behind the swing and the darker child is on the ground, the stories are more often the child fell off the swing. Among kids who have friends of all backgrounds, etc., and they're not, racist kids, they're just human and taking in all the stuff that we have in the environment. So let me make a couple of comments about television. TV's powerful as, technology and the online presence is. So over the last several years, many TV shows, really across the planet, have taken great efforts to increase the diversity of main characters. So you certainly see in the United States doctors and nurses on TV, scientists on TV, who are of all kinds of cultural background, gender, etc., because there's been some effort among TV shows to increase diversity. But knowing how insidious implicit bias is, there are other impacts on people, kids and adults who are watching TV. So this researcher looked at about 20 TV shows that had black actors in major positive roles, doctors, lawyers, etc. And then took 10-second clips of these shows. 10-second clips where a white actor was speaking to either a black person on the show or a white person on the show. Took these 10-second clips. Then what they did was to edit out the faces of who the actor was speaking with. So the 10-second clips, you just saw the white actor. And they asked people, do you think that the white actor is speaking to someone who he has positive regard for or not? Do you think that the actor is speaking to someone who he likes? And what they found out that there was a strong correlation between thinking positively and feeling positively towards a person you're speaking to and the person being white versus being black. And it begins to speak to the kind of subtleties in facial expression, eyebrows, etc., among people who consciously, I suspect, feel that they're equitable, fair, people who try to treat other people the way they'd like to be treated, but being socialized in the same culture, they've inculcated in subtle ways bias. They're not bad people. But that's how subtle and insidious the process of implicit bias can be. And I'm focusing on race, but the same process operates in terms of gender, perceived sexual orientation, weight. Some powerful biases around the world in many of the Western countries around weight. There certainly are countries where, quote, overweight is connected with prosperity. But there certainly are lots of countries where, quote, overweight is connected with all kinds of negative things. And there certainly are lots of biases around religion or perceived religious affiliation. So the fact that I'm focusing on race doesn't diminish in any way the power of implicit bias related to all kinds of other identity characteristics. But this is, I find, some powerful research because, the TV industry is trying to do the, quote, the right thing and trying to have more women, major roles, people of color, etc. But that occurs in the context of many societies, many countries, where the bias is almost baked in, if you will, into the system. I'll give you an idea of some research. And there are tons of research we could talk about in implicit bias. So one of the classic research designs is they send in resumes, CVs, in response to job ads. This has been going on so long. When they started doing this in the late 80s, the job ads were in the newspapers. Now they're online. And they would send in resumes or CVs in response to the job ads. The resumes were identical, except for the fact that some of them had the name Emily or Greg, some had the name Lakeisha or Jamal. And then they would look at the rate of callbacks. And in the United States, the names Lakeisha and Jamal sort of key to people that these are probably African Americans. And names like Emily and Greg sort of signify that these are probably not African Americans. They looked at the number of callbacks. They found that about 50% more callbacks occurred when the CVs had the name Emily or Greg. These particular researchers who first started doing this created a second level to the research. They created better, higher level resumes, better backgrounds, higher degrees, etc., both with the name Emily and Greg, and a higher level resumes with the name Lakeisha and Jamal. The higher level resumes resulted in additional callbacks for those CVs with the name Emily and Greg, but almost no change for those with the name Lakeisha and Jamal. And you can just imagine in the world that we live in the impact of having a, quote, Muslim-sounding name and applying for a major corporate job. So some other, what I see as powerful research. So this was done in the legal field. And so they took 60 partners in some prestigious law firms, put 30 of the partners in one room, 30 in another room, and they gave them the same document to review. The only difference was who wrote the document, but I'll get to that. So the document had embedded in it, as you can see, 7 spelling, grammar errors, 6 technical writing errors, 5 errors in fact, 4 errors in analysis of fact. The exact same document they gave to the partners in each room. But in one room they said, this document was written by Thomas Mayer, third-year associate, went to New York University Law School, and is African American. For the other room, they said this is written by Thomas May, third-year associate, went to New York University Law School, Caucasian. They gave them the papers to look at the errors. They found that of the 7 spelling grammar errors, they found 2.9 for the Caucasian Thomas Mayer, but they found 5.8 for the African American Thomas Mayer. Of the 6 technical errors, they found 4.1 for the Caucasian Thomas Mayer, but they found 4.9 for the African American Thomas Mayer, and so forth. I mean, well-meaning people, who consciously, explicitly, are trying to do the right thing, but they're human and they've been socialized in a context, in a society, and they've taken this stuff related to race and gender. And it can pop up, if you will, at times when you don't even think about it. A few months ago, this is around gender, I fly a lot as I present workshops around the United States. I got on a plane, I look in the cockpit, and I see a woman as the captain. And she looked, quote, young to me. So I immediately say to myself, oh, don't go there. She's as well-trained as anyone else. So, it's kind of self-talk. So I sit down. About 20 minutes later, we're in turbulence. And I start thinking about the turbulence, her gender, and her age. I mean, that's how insidious the process is. And I'm saying to myself, well, wait a minute. This is the work you've done for 50 years. But that's how insidious. I think of the power of ability and disability in our societies as one form of bias. So I remember having a family member seriously injured in a hospital for an operation. So the family and myself were on the 3rd floor of the hospital, gathered outside the room where he'll be brought to after the operation. And hopefully the operation has gone well. And, we're up all night, we're stressed, we're anxious, which, is fertile ground for bias. Long hallway. Every once in a while, the elevator opens at the end of the hallway. And we're hoping the doctor comes out, tells us how things went. I found that when the elevator door opened and a woman came out of the elevator, I was looking the other way. When a man came out of the elevator, I was looking to see if it was a doctor. I'm saying, wait a minute. I mean, but under stress, your executive functions just aren't working as well, and all of that early learning comes out. Because the early learning, it's there. I mean, we just are better or worse in trying to manage it, but it's there. All the stuff that we're exposed to in a society, it's back there. And hopefully we work hard at managing, but it's back there. Sometimes one of the ways you'll see it is a fine, upstanding person, equitable, fair, social justice leader, etc., is unfortunately has Alzheimer's disease, is in a facility, and is calling the doctors and nurses by the most racist, sexist names. Fine, upstanding person, but the executive functions are no longer operating, and all of that early learning that we thought went away, it's still there. So as soon as we see someone, see their height, what we perceive their weight to be, their complexion, the way they're dressed, etc., we have a first impression. It happens immediately. I'm going to try to give you a sense of how quickly it happens. I'm going to ask you if you could number, if you have a piece of paper, from 1 to 4 down the left side. If you can do it on your phone, your iPad, whatever, just 1 to 4. Okay, if the computer cooperates, you'll see 4 pictures. Each one will be on the screen for 10 seconds. I'd like for you to write down the first 2 words that come to mind when you see the picture. Try not to think, analyze, reflect, etc. Just whatever the first 2 words are that come to mind. All right, let's see if this works. Okay, I'd like you to turn to the person next to you. If you're in a group of 3, that's fine, and share your first impressions. All right. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let me hear, what are some of the associations you had to this top left picture? Anyway. Queer. Eager.
Engaging.
Huh? Engaging. Comedian. Psychiatrist. Okay. So you know her. What about the top right picture? Scary. What do you think? Grandmother. Hardworking. Kind. What about this one here? Creepy. Yeah, I get creepy a lot. Musician. Huh? I've got it. You haven't. What about this last one here? It's not Robin Williams. It's not Robin Williams. No. Professor. I get a lot. Yeah. Professor. Yeah. I'm going to give you the answers in a moment. But let me say, you can't turn the process off. As soon as you see someone, as soon as you hear someone, as soon as you smell someone, everyone has a first impression. And I think I would like to believe, well, I have a first impression, then I get additional data so I can reach a more informed conclusion. The reality is your more informed conclusion is influenced by your first impression. It doesn't go away. The influence might be 0.5%, 5%, 10, 20, 30%. I mean, it depends on your own life experiences, depends on the context and the situation, but nobody's assessment is 100% rational, objective. And we know that the more that you get a sense of your own tendencies, your own inclinations, sort of, what makes you feel comfortable, what makes you feel uncomfortable, the more you can authentically get that understanding, the better position you're in responding to someone more in terms of who they are, as opposed to the stuff that's in your head. But it's part of the human condition. We all have first impressions. They're not inherently good or bad, but let me tell you about these people. Okay. So this is Martine Rothblatt. She's the CEO of United Therapeutics. She's a transgender woman who's been married to her wife for over 35 years and has a couple of kids, and is one of the highest paid CEOs in the United States. So I don't recall her name. I left it in the hotel. But she's a mass murderer. and the way she murdered people, she would put rat poison in tea and would have tea parties. This weird guy is David Warren. So David developed the first prototype for the black box, which went from a prototype to a part of every commercial airline in the world. And the professor, the professor is Dr. Shipman, who is, Dr. Shipman, right? Yeah, murderer, believed to have murdered over, 300 people. Dr. Shipman was putting stuff in the IVs of people. Yeah. And there was an attorney, a woman who was taking care of her mother as her mother got older and was ill, passed away. So she went to put together her mother's finances and detected someone had been siphoning off some money. And so that led to the investigation of Dr. Shipman. They exhumed lots of bodies, and at least 250, maybe 300 people he killed. They weren't sure because there was some medication in their system that might have been the right amount, et cetera, but mass killer. I have a couple of pictures of Dr. Shipman. Once you see the picture with him, disheveled and a beard, you have a different first impression. Martine Rothblatt, I have a few pictures of her wearing the same black outfit. One of the pictures, she's leaning back with her arm over a chair. I get different first impressions. Another picture of her in the same black outfit, she's at a podium and there's a table in a corporate boardroom with other people sitting. I get a different first impression. So when you think about just how you hold your body, you think about interviewing someone. They come in certainly dressed, but whether they're leaning, how many degrees to the side they're leaning, where they're putting their arm, all of the things that impact our first impressions in addition to the things we think are part of our rational assessment. So a lot of research being done, and this is controversial, this is tentative, so that's the caveat, about correlates of implicit bias that we think are in the brain. So the amygdala, about an almond-shaped part of the brain in the posterior part of the brain, responds, shows excitation when we're in a fearful situation, fight or flight kind of situation. So in one research design, they show people either the face of a black man or faces of a white man. When they show people faces of a black man, there's excitation in the amygdala. Even if the person watching the photograph is black. Everybody's sort of socialized in the same society. But a lot of research being done about correlates in the brain, areas of our functioning that's out of, conscious control. You can't say, okay, I'm going to make my amygdala start, firing. Yeah. So all kinds of things in our autonomic nervous system that we don't have direct control over are now being examined in terms of correlating with implicit bias. In Italy, there was some research where you look at a screen, you see a hand, very slowly a needle goes through the hand. Yeah, right. So most of us have an aversive response. If you're measuring the moisture on your fingertips, when you have that aversive response, there's moisture on your fingertips. The needle can either be going through the hand of a black person or a white person. When the needle is going through the hand of a black person, there's very little moisture on the fingertips. So that's how insidious and powerful the process is for people who are socialized like us in the same society. Now, just as I'm talking about race, again, we could be talking about gender, we could be talking about perceived sexual orientation, we could be talking about societies where the bias is more related to how large someone's beard is. We could be talking about the subtle bias attached to tribal dress that signifies you belonging to one group or another, etc. But race, complexion is a powerful dynamic in, I would say, almost every country in the face of the earth. So, when I spend time in Cuba, you see complexion differences. When I spend time in Brazil, which often people say is, multicultural, et cetera, you see complexion differences in terms of the kind of employment that people have. One of the researchers that's done a lot of work around race, particularly complexion, is a researcher called Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt. Won one of these Genius Awards a few years ago. She has a couple of very interesting, powerful research designs around race and complexion. So one of them, she went into a prison where there are a large number of African Americans incarcerated for very serious crimes. And she got their photographs. And she put their photographs into two groups. Those who look, quote, stereotypically more black, darker skin, kinkier hair, broader nose, broader lips. The other group of photographs were those black men who look, quote, stereotypically less black, lighter skin, straighter hair, narrow nose, narrow lips. Then she ran the correlations with sentencing. And the more, quote, black you look, the more likely you were to get the death penalty over life imprisonment. The caveat is, if the victim was white. When the victim was black, there was only 1 percentage point difference. Now, there's no judge who's there saying, okay, before sentencing, let me see how broad someone's nose is. I mean, the process is more insidious and subtle than that. You can find her research, by the way, online if you just type in looking death-worthy. Looking death-worthy. So, so this major dilemma, I mean, in spite of all of the work that we've done over the years in virtually every society around equity and fairness, the progress that we've made around race, there still is this powerful unconscious bias, the ways in which we categorize people, in spite of how hard we've worked and we've tried. And so there are no simple answers, simple strategies to eliminate implicit bias. I mean, it's so baked into who we are. But I do want to end by giving you a couple of areas that I think are hopeful in terms of things we might consider doing to reduce implicit bias. So the whole notion of education. See, the idea that people would go to workshops, understand what implicit bias is, how it develops, how it impacts decision-making, how it impacts choices, and then what are some of the things that we can do about it. So there's really some promise in that, but I am the first to say, in spite of the fact that I do these workshops around the world, the workshops alone are not going to impact, certainly not long-term, someone's propensity to be biased. But it is an element. Certainly, as commonplace or simple as it might seem, increasing self-awareness and focus around your own behavior, and hopefully modifying it. I think it's weird to think about everything you say and do all the time, but I will set aside like 4 or 5 days every few months, and I'll try to pay attention to, the kind of thoughts I have about people, the kind of assumptions that I'm making. I remember I was doing this, I was working with a very prestigious law firm in New York City. And so leading up to my work, I had, 3 conference calls. And on the conference calls were 2 partners in a law firm, 2 associates, and they always had 1 or 2 kind of clerical types on the conference calls. And so we had all these planning conference calls, and then the day comes for me to do the first workshop. Fly to Manhattan, go to this big, building, go up to the 40-something floor, this prestigious law firm, and I'm sitting in a room waiting for them to come in, and they all come in. And then I try to figure out, who do I think is the partner? I was probably about 50%. Yeah. But I try every once in a while to set aside a few days and just try to pay attention to the kind of assumptions that I have, because it's one of the ways of getting a clearer sense of my own tendencies, my own proclivities in terms of bias. And then seeking opportunities to be exposed to other viewpoints, other ways of seeing the world, other people and groups. You know, I think particularly in the world we live in now, you know, this goes without saying, there's greater divisions philosophically, politically, etc. You know, I read things that reinforce my beliefs. I only go to websites that confirm, you know, my viewpoint. Most of the people I hang with are people who have my same viewpoints, and I, you know, sort of think, well, there are lots of different viewpoints, but I have the better one. And so it's not about abandoning your viewpoint and taking someone else's. It's about exploring ways of understanding other ways of seeing the world and other experiences, which is easier said than done because, boy, the proclivity, the power of pulling ourselves, you know, towards what seems right is, you know, it's hard. You know, my wife and I were spending a weekend at a friend's house, farmhouse, and he is politically left, you know, progressive, leaning, et cetera, clearly. But he will regularly watch a news show that is very right-leaning. I mean, I couldn't do it. But, so you know what my political proclivity is. But he can, and he says that not only does it give him a perspective on another way of seeing the world, but he says every once in a while he listens to someone who's really sharp, really is bright, analytic. He doesn't believe in the content of what they're saying, but there are other ways of seeing the world. And if we're serious about the stuff we talk about, diversity and inclusion, that's part of it. I mean, there is, and you may know, Chimamanda Adichie, right? Yeah. So she's this incredible writer, poet. She has a lot of stuff online. One of the videos that she has online that some of you might have seen, it's on YouTube, it's got, I don't know how many clicks and views, is the danger of a single story, which I would strongly, strongly suggest that people view. It's about a 15-minute thing on YouTube. But the basic, you know, tenet that she's getting across, which you can probably detect by the title, is that people are complex. And if you only look at and try to experience one piece of who they are, then you overlook the rest of who they are, because we're all complex. The other recommendation I have is a book that came out only about a month ago called Biased, and it's by Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, the Genius Award winner, and she's at Stanford. Really an engaging, easy book to read, but it has stories about her own family and their sort of discoveries of bias among the family and among her kids, and lots of data. But the data and the research is presented in a very accessible way. So on an organizational level, I mean, one of the powerful ways of reducing implicit bias is, you know, through the work of leaders, and leaders of all kinds of organizations and leaders at all levels. Because I think leaders have the capacity, and hopefully they do this regularly, to foster creative ways of thinking about difference, fostering strategies and organizations, primarily because they have the kind of power to do things. Leaders can also model not only their individual behavior, but they can model things that they do with their other leaders. Like a leader who regularly, when she or he approves education for some level of staff, also provides that education for the leadership. So the ways in which leaders can model their own behavior, and they can model the kind of management of their leadership group in a way that they would hope that other people in other parts of the organization would manage their groups. Then leaders can create expectations and they can reward things that are being done that enhance diversity, reduce bias, and hopefully they can hold people accountable and do whatever it takes to, at one end of the spectrum, there are leaders who write books about as soon as you start to fire some people who refuse to be engaged in an equitable, fair way, and as soon as people recognize that you're willing to go that far, or to not hire someone who might be a major researcher, but she or he might have no interest in engaging people in an equitable, fair way, when you see a leader refuse to hire someone like that, that can send a message. And then certainly, to be more specific, a leader who will require that departments set specific diversity goals. But the kind of goals that are in line with the kind of work that they do. I mean, one size doesn't fit all. Goals that make sense for a particular department or group and that are measurable. Also, you go through a diversity implicit bias workshop of any type, a week passes, a month passes, and people forget. So there are ways in which you can create reminders. So I left my phone in the hotel, but on my phone, my screensaver has a picture of a brain and the letters IB. Every time I pick up my phone, I think of implicit bias. It's something called the PREMAC principle. You take a high frequency event and you pair it with something you want to be high frequency. It's the theory behind, for smokers, putting a cancer warning on a pack of cigarettes. Picking up the pack of cigarettes is high frequency, and you hope that they will read the cancer warning. So you want to pair those together. So putting it on, picking up my cell phone is a high frequency event. and I change the picture about every 2 months so I don't become habituated to it. The phone in my office has a little post-it dot with the letters IB. I change those, the color every once in a while so I don't become habituated to that. So there are lots of creative reminders. Another one, I was working with a group of physicians who screen applications and interview candidates for our medical school. The end of the workshop, I handed out a piece of paper, had about 15 words and concepts I used in the workshop. I asked them to circle, each person, to circle 3 and only 3 that would remind them of the workshop 90 days in the future. I then collected them all, did a frequency analysis, came up with the 5 things they said would remind them. I made a poster, put it in the room where they gather just before they go in and do the interviews, as a reminder. And the words are words that they came up with. What we didn't do, what we had planned to do, we loaned them an iPad that has information about the applicant. I was going to make the screensaver of 5 words, but we never got around to it. And by the way, the screensaver had information about the candidate, but also had a photograph. Not a good idea for all the reasons I've been talking about. Diversity of search committees, we can talk more about that, but we're out of time. And then I don't want to leave without saying what hopefully is obvious, that we're all complex, and I can talk about race, but the reality of the complexity of people is there are intersections of all kinds of identity characteristics. And those identity characteristics, what's prominent changes depending on the context. I'm here in New Zealand, boy, my identity as being American, I think about it more than, once I go back home, you know, I'll think about my race in a different way. I'll go to another environment and I'll think about my maleness. And so I don't want to leave without, you know, emphasizing the intersectionality of all of the different kinds of identities that we have, and hope that all of us see the importance of constantly and regularly working to eliminate structural racism, sexism, homophobia, all of the biases that are becoming so embedded in our society around the kind of hatred towards Muslims and people of other religious faiths. So I hope we see that as, you know, part of our work as citizens of this planet. And then I've been talking in the last few days about the idea of creating here at the university someone who thinks about, works on diversity every day, full time. So it's not left to hoping that other people will think about it and do something about it when they have full-time jobs, when they may not be in the position of authority to do anything. You know, in my Chief Diversity Officer role, I'm part of the Vice Chancellor's cabinet, senior leadership. So the vice presidents, the leaders of every other part of the university, I sit down with them. And so the creation of a Chief Diversity Officer position is not a cure-all, but it really is an important step in changing, enhancing a culture. And so lastly, I leave you with the notion that none of this work can we do alone. I mean, all of the work requires us to be in partnership, you know, to not point fingers, but to hold hands, to think about how we can build coalitions. You know, one of my favorite poets who's not on this earth anymore, but I often reflect on the poetry of Maya Angelou, just a powerful poet, and I'd like to leave you with this. Now, if you listen closely, I'll tell you what I know. Storm clouds are gathering. The wind is going to blow. The race of man is suffering, and I can hear the moan. Because nobody, but nobody, can make it out here alone. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Reese. Very enlightening indeed, very stimulating, and I'm sure that you have a lot of questions. He started from the embryonic formation of unconscious bias, its manifestation, and towards the end, a great poem, and before that, some of the ways in which we can address subconscious bias in our everyday life. So thank you so much. Now, I'm sure he's willing to entertain some questions. I'm sure there are a lot of questions which are ready to jump out of the brain. Yeah. So please make it short, because I'm sure there are a lot of questions. And please tell us maybe who you are to dispel that wall of suspicion and subconscious bias that we have when we see you. Yeah.
So this is just a really short in my name's Naomi. Thank you so much.
Yes, there's a camera. Where's the camera? Yeah? Oh, it's over there.
So it will be made available online?
We'll try our best to do that. We'll make use of the cyberspace communication mechanisms to make sure that not just the 100 people here, but the millions of people can see it. Yes, please. Oh, sorry, because it's being recorded, so please speak into the microphone.
Hi, my name is John, and I'm very biased. I try not to be. Well, two things really. Firstly, is if it's subconscious bias, can we ever change that? We're always going to be biased. And secondly, have you noticed any changes since the 90s? Because someone like me who was brought up in the 50s and 60s, childhood impressions is going to be very different from a very different environment to someone who's a millennial and was brought up in the 2000s, and the environment has changed. So have you noticed any positive trends there?
Yeah, great questions. I do think that things that are unconscious can change in the sense that unconscious things link with things that we do in the way we behave consciously. So I think we can change those behaviors. And the assumption is that if you change the behaviors, you're impacting what's unconscious. I mean, to the other question, so over the 50 years, I've obviously, society has changed. I don't run around the streets the way I used to. There are other forms of protest. There's certainly greater fairness and equity in terms of there not being signs about who can enter or not. But at the same time, in a kind of painful way, I think that the unconscious bias is at the same level, or in some cases even more extreme than 20 or 30 years ago. There's no way of measuring that. There is, I'll give you one piece of research. So someone looked at someone's data on the implicit association test. They looked at data up to, from the 1990s, up to 2015. And they saw a slight decrease, this is across the United States, in racial bias, slight decrease in gender bias, a larger decrease in bias towards sexual orientation, and a slight increase in bias towards weight. Now that went to 2015. My bias, I label this a bias. My bias, if someone did it from 2015 to 2019, I think the decrease that we saw would go away. But that's my bias, that's not research.
Hi, my name is Diane. I have a quick question. Like you said, even if people try really hard to get rid of their existing bias, it's quite hard work. But if it was possible, would it necessarily make the world a better place, or will there be unforeseen consequences that kind of we didn't intend in the first place? I just wanted to ask your view on that.
If I think that, tell me again.
So if there was no bias at all, would the world necessarily be a better place?
I'm pretty sure, but I'm not sure, I am pretty sure that we can't eliminate all bias.
Yeah.
But when I am in organizations that have put in a lot of effort to decrease bias, increase engagement, you can feel it. I mean, you can feel it, and you can hear it in the way people speak. You can hear it in what leaders say and what they do. And I've seen it more in organizations than I haven't seen it in any country, because I guess countries are so complex. But the optimistic part is that there are organizations, there are universities that have worked hard at reducing bias, and I do think you can make significant headway in organizations. Trying to change a country, great question.
Hello, my name's Otis. I'm studying to become a primary school teacher, so this is like super awesome. We talk about bias a lot, and I've got some sweet quotes for my essays. I was wondering, as from a sort of a youth sort of view, and in schools particularly, do you think there's particular ways teachers or people like that could address sort of we talk about a lot of our own biases in classrooms, but we don't really address how we could address the biases of the students. Because you talked about from the very young age. And also just if you think maybe schools could benefit from something like a chief diversity role.
But, to the biases of children or to other people, what you have a lot of control over is yourself. What you have almost no control over is another human being. So I get asked a lot, so what can we do in hospitals about the biases that patients have? What can we do with biases that students have? I mean, you can work at making classrooms more fair and equitable, but it's much harder to change another person unless they're motivated to listen to you. But boy, there's great opportunities for teachers to run their classes in a different way, more equitable and fair way, to model for students the kind of openness, the kind of self-reflection, willingness to admit errors, admit their own bias. I think that's helpful. What's unfortunate is we live in a litigious planet. So you can imagine a teacher admitting her or his own bias, and a month later they're in court trying to defend why they've been discriminatory. So that's the unfortunate part. So I think teachers unfortunately have to be careful how they admit their own biases. Yeah, great question.
Hello, I'm Uwe Zachheim. I work with people with intellectual disabilities, and I teach art to youth in prison. First of all, I wanted to just say this was the most articulate and easy to understand lecture I've attended since the 3 years of living in New Zealand.
That sounds like there's less a comment about me and more about New Zealand. Okay.
Mostly a joke, but I just wonder. I grew up in Los Angeles, and in the 80s and 90s, in sort of a lower middle class neighborhood kind of thing, and that was when gang culture and this whole there was a lot of division between the Hispanics and the blacks, and then whites were either surfers or country club kind of kid style, and then so there's all this stuff. Now working in the prison, it was quite amazing to see Maori and Pacifica kids listening to the same rap that I heard, with the kids growing up on the schoolyard. And then on a recent trip to America, I went to Rodeo Drive, and in all the fancy, usually European shops, they all have this like blingy gangsta clothes, but costing $1,000 for a hoodie. And I'm just wondering how much media and music, the role models, all these different things, how this is reinforcing the negative stereotypes and sort of giving a negative, like some of the music, say like gangster rap or something like that, it's giving a voice to people who have a legitimate gripe based on what we've just heard. But then it also seems to be giving a global voice to people who just like don't. I think my question is taking up too many words, but where it's sort of like giving an easy out. It's like I could just hate them, the other, and not develop either one's own local culture of dissonance to whatever wrong has been done, but then also not do the work to find resolution. So sorry.
And you see that connected with people sort of co-opting the music?
Yes. And then another area, like in gender, I just recently saw a music video with Miley Cyrus dressed in red latex and flashing on the screen, and a common lyric is, "I'm not an object." But she's there fully objectifying herself, but then giving this other message, "I'm not an object." And it's just like really conflicting and confusing.
Yeah. Well, I personally think that media and music is so much more complex in general today than it was 30, 40 years ago. Not better or worse, but just more complex. People will use music, have lyrics that are much more, 30, 40 years ago, you had music about "I love you," etc. It wasn't controversial. There are so many lyrics now that are controversial and can be viewed in lots of different ways. And some people will think that a group is sort of co-opting lyrics. Some people will find certain lyrics offensive. Other people will find it expands their identity. So I don't have any answer other than that's a struggle. But, I think 20, 30 years from now, we'll look back on it and say, it made sense during that era, and we'll be on to something else 20, 30 years from now.
Kia ora, my name's Sarah. The slide that came up earlier about intersections. So I fit into quite a lot of those intersections, quite a lot in fact. And so my question basically is, how, if we are subjected or in these structures where subconscious bias is directed towards us on a regular occurrence, obviously that fills me with quite a lot of fear, and terror, kind of low-key terror. But what my question is do we have any strategies that we can put in place to protect ourselves from those things? Or how do we go about creating boundaries around that? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I do. The whole proliferation of bystander behavior can empower all of us to say something or do something when you see something happening in the environment or something happening to an individual. The caveat or the strategy to consider is what's your own style of personality. Some people are constantly, they see something, they're in your face. Other people, their style is to write a note. Other people, to wait, they reflect and then make a comment. The other dimension is who is the person who is doing the thing that's inappropriate? If it's the president of a corporation, if it's your supervisor, you might approach that differently than if it's a colleague or a friend. But I think that the whole notion of bystander response is a way of all of us contributing to changing an environment. Yeah.
Yeah, in the back.
All right, got your steps in.
Thank you. Tanakwe, thank you so much. I'm Bronwyn. I've read a lot, and in a way your whole lecture is answering the question, but I've been reading about some of your work with universities and schools and hospitals after really traumatic events. And as institutions, looking back on it, what do you think are the things that universities can do that help communities like ours after an event like we've just had? It's a huge question, but...
It's a huge question. There's no simple answer. Everything I've said about leadership, from my perspective, in terms of leader of a country, if we can borrow her, we'll barter, we'll give you half of our gross national product if we can just for a couple of months. Leadership. I think that the way that people come together, if you can find ways of extending that, so that kind of coming together and mutual support during a period of pain, if that can be, this is not the right word, but used to extend that kind of connection. I mean, it's hard enough to have connections across gender, race, socioeconomic status, etc. Crises and the pain that ensues often brings people together across all of those lines. If you can find ways of keeping that going and holding on to that. You see it on college campuses, university campuses. You'll have a crisis, or you'll have students take over a building and create a crisis. Then things happen that haven't happened before. What often doesn't happen is you don't hold on to that momentum and make that part of the culture. So I think you have an opportunity here with the ways in which people across the whole country have come together, to hold on and to use that. Use is not the right word, but to use it in some powerful way. And it's unfortunate, very unfortunate that you have to have an event to do that, but it has brought people, connected people across all kinds of differences.
Okay, we have 3 hands up. 1, 2, and 3. Here.
Yeah, I can probably hear you. Yeah.
That's being recorded.
Oh.
And I was just wondering, when you're thinking about leadership and organisations, I think one of the biggest dilemmas for leaders in organisations is when you are working towards diversity and totally committed to that, there are 2 dilemmas you face. The first is if you take affirmative action and you say, we need to broaden the face of the institution, you are slammed with, we're not having people here just because of their ethnicity, their diversity, etc. And then you have meritocratic people who say, we're only having people here who can prove they're here on merit. And so in the research that you have been doing, what advice and guidance would you give leaders of organisations who realise that diversity is the cornerstone of the organisation, but how do you reconcile those 2 opposing views, that if somebody is there because of affirmative action, you need to have gender equity or etc., then they're only there because they're a woman, or they're only there because they're black, or they're only there because they are etc., or they got there because they're the best. So what do you think the research is telling us?
I mean, well, first, and I hope everyone endorses this, that you never hire someone only because they're a woman or they're a person of color. You also never have, I've never experienced an organization where there aren't some people who will say that. Part of what I think strong leadership is that you go ahead in spite of that, because if over time you'll create a culture where people will recognize that you have incredible people of all kinds of backgrounds, and that you're not sacrificing one iota of excellence. But along the way, you'll have those critiques, and I mean, you can't really do anything about, the diversity of people. There'll be people who will say that even though you have 1 woman and 147 men. Yeah. So I try not to let that be an impediment. I think at Duke University, there have been those critiques from when I came 23 years ago to now. Yeah. But it's a challenge for leaders who aren't willing to stay the course, in the light of those kind of criticisms.
Yes, so we'll have those last two. Yeah.
Yep. Kia ora, Professor. Thank you. Our elections are all created on bias, and you know who we might vote for and pick and other things. Do we need to recreate electioneering, and if so, how do we do that?
I don't know. Don't know. Some things I have ideas about.
Thank you. My name is Sabrina. I come from China. Here.
Sorry.
Yeah. 15 years ago, I was living in Wellington. And after 2 years, and I said, I'm going to Christchurch. So people in Wellington say to me, don't go there, Sabrina, because they're skinheads. But here I am, 14 years I'm here. I've seen the city has changed a lot. Like tonight, we can openly discuss about this. But to be honest, it hasn't been an easy 14 years for me. You left everything behind, you speak second language. So I had an event one day. I was waiting for bus, because when I first come here, I don't drive. So I have to go to work at 7 o'clock. So 6:30 a.m., I was waiting outside a bus in a cold winter morning. And the bus driver was sitting there with the bus door closed. He was reading newspaper. He saw me there. Because I was an Asian, she won't open the door. So I was a very brave girl. I knocked the door. So I knocked the door. He didn't open. So my third approach, I start to knock the door consistently. And then I enter the bus. I realize I'm not in a good situation because only me and another Persian girl sitting in the bus. Then I was thinking about how do I get off the bus because he's going to hate me. And I'm going to be late to work. So after stupidness for 20 minutes, and it's about time, I need to get off the bus. Well, I forgot one thing. He was saying in the bus, because I knocked the door, I mashed the door, he was saying, you F Asian, you go back to F Asian. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, picture I was in that situation. So I was sitting all the way in the back because I was scared. And what I did is I like to confront the problem. Okay, so instead of get off the bus from the back door, I walk all the way to the front to the driver. And I put my head close to him, and I said, I was invited to your country to work here at the emergency department in Hutt Valley Hospital. And then I said F word, and I get off the bus. My story haven't finished because honestly, I temporarily win the situation, but I didn't feel bad. I didn't feel good, sorry. And my question is there a better way? I was picturing, if it's China, we open the door, we have all kinds of immigrants, how the Chinese government going to cope? The first couple of years won't be easy, isn't it, right? So I'm thinking, yes, it has to be both ways. So my second question is, that was a one-off thing. I was temporarily winning. Yeah. And I have to go to work. Yeah. I have to speak second language. Yeah. I have to learn so many things. I work with different people. I experience stereotype many, many times, but I'm okay. So sometimes you do have to deal with these things. At the same time, you need to perform. So one day I get a look when I was in a meeting, and people just say English words, and I say, excuse me, I didn't get it. But that person just repeat that words loudly and then give me a look. How can you be here? You don't speak our language. But this kind of behavior I experience quite oftenly, but how, I have personality as well, so that's that person. How do we have a better approach that, it's a win-win situation, that we just have a little bit more tolerance? When I was in the heart hospital, everybody go to work, they have orientation 1 week. you get paid. So I was surprised as a Chinese citizen. I was like, wow, you get paid when you're just watching people doing their work. So my boss actually extended my orientation week for 2 weeks. So I got paid for 2 weeks and I'm not doing any work. So because of that, I work really hard and I win my credibility. Yeah. And 6 months later, the person who hired me received a flower from the manager and say, you actually hire really good staff. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I had a sense of, want to return to this country to do a better work, to perform. But sometimes we have to cope with a lot of things and we just keep it quiet. Yeah. So that's why I wanted my voice to be heard.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
You
thank
clapped,
you for sharing that.
You are great. Thanks.
Yeah. A whole host of thoughts. Yeah. We don't know whether that bus driver, whether you've had an impact after he's thought and reflected on what happened. Yeah. But one of the other thoughts I have is, just the power of storytelling. Because, narratives, because we often don't know the complexities of people's lives and experiences, which can't be summed up in a PowerPoint or a slide or a presentation. And often the texture of an experience that we can share and finding ways and times when people can do that can be very powerful in changing cultures. I mean, you have CEOs of corporations who go to training to understand and figure out how they can do better at telling authentic stories. Because just the way we're constructed as people, it's one of the ways they impact us and they move us. No, but thank you for that story.
Well, thank you so much for the questions, and thank you so much for the great responses. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end, and I know there's still some questions. I saw some hands half-heartedly going up. We don't want to be here until tomorrow morning, since we booked the place until 8 o'clock. Now, I would like to invite the representative of the Macmillan Brown Centre to present the gifts that we have prepared. Yeah. So we've been privileged today to listen to one of the leading experts in the field, in the world, Professor Benjamin Reese. From here, he will go to Australia, and he's told me already that he's willing to come around to the Pacific again, so and stay a bit longer and engage with this peaceful part of the world much more. So thank you so much for the very brilliant, very stimulating and inspiring words of wisdom that you have provided us with. It's food for thought, not just for today, but the days ahead, as well as the weeks ahead and the years ahead. Certainly in a world where we're yearning for creative and innovative ways of engaging with prejudice, with subconscious bias, and of course, explosions of violence in various parts of the world. I think it's important to keep reminding ourselves of the need to be vigilant, of the need to engage productively, positively with each other. And of course, we start with ourselves. I've been telling the interesting stories of I've worked in different universities around the world, and you experience, if you're off color like me, then you experience all sorts of interesting things on the way. For instance, in here, I've been, asked whether I was either a student or a security guard. Maybe I don't look like a professor. But of course, those are the realities of life. So thank you so much. And I think we have sufficient energy to express our vibrant thanks by putting our heads together.
I cry easily, so please.
Well, thank you so much for coming. So, oh, it's very good. Brilliant. Good. I think it's probably the first time they